Yes, I think that you can, although it requires, I think, like any interesting and fundamental issue in church history, it's going to require creative thinking, creative fidelity, to put it in terms of one early 20th century thinker, or synthesis, creative synthesis, which another major theologian, Yves Congar, defined tradition as ongoing synthesis. And there's a lot of times in church history where if you were in the moment and you were trying to predict how these various seemingly opposed opinions were going to be reconciled, or if they could be reconciled, it would have been very difficult to predict how that would go, what it would look like, what a real synthesis would look like. And so I do think as a Catholic, if you're going to be a confident Universalist and dedicated Catholic, you have to be honest that it's not like that is the official dogma of the Catholic Church. It just isn't. But then the next question is, well, then what are the doctrines and the dogmas? At what levels do they come in terms of their authority? And then in what ways can you or can you not interpret them or revisit them or reconceptualize them in a way that fits into a greater whole that would accommodate a Universalist hope? Some people think that's just like, playing games, like sophistical games or something like that. I think it's just called theology. I mean, that's always what's had to happen. Nicaea 1 anathematizes anyone who says that the Son differs from the Father, quote, in hypostasis, hypostasis. Well, 150 years later, you have to say that's the only way they differ. So you have Basil the Great, for example, writing letters trying to explain, well, hold on, how can you maintain what you're now saying with these prior anathemas, which seem to oppose that? And in terms on the letter of on the level of the letter, they do oppose that. So what does he have to do? He has to reinterpret it. There's various ways to do that. You could say, well, in the historical context, the Council Fathers meant something different than we now mean by that word. Or you could do something even more creatively and say, precisely because tradition or the statements of a council are authoritative, that they have the Spirit as the author of their meaning, that meaning is potentially infinite. So even if the original speakers or writers or authors of a given canon, council, text, or whatever might have intended or had some very narrow target in mind whenever they wrote this anathema, or where they opposed this position, or they proposed this other position, it can always be the case, as with Scripture, as the Church Fathers often said of Scripture, that the depths of its meaning are infinite. So when a Scripture writer or Council Fathers write something down, can they intend the infinite? No, most of the time they're intending very specific things that they know aren't true, but that doesn't mean that the truth itself is limited. So this gets into a whole, you can open up then and say, in fact, one sign, it's not always the case, but one sign of properly, like doing due diligence to the authority, to even the divine inspiration of tradition, is to expect that it means more than it says. The spirit and the letter are not always in harmony. Now, in a given case, will somebody's reinterpreting, rereading, reading deeper into the meaning of an authoritative text, will it be persuasive? That's something you can't really predict ahead of time, any more than you could have predicted that Basil's explanation of Nicaea's anathematizing of those that say the Father and Son differ in hypostasis would have been successful, and yet it was, right? So there's I don't think, I'm one of those perhaps strange Catholics I don't think there's a general theory of the development of doctrine that can give you flawless and ahistorical criteria by which you just, you apply those and you can tell what a certain proposal, if it's true or false. They can guide you in making those judgments, but they can never be, you can only go so far in that formal way. You have to get into the actual details of the proposal. So all that to say, I think you can be a confident Universalist and a Catholic, a dedicated Catholic, but you do have to expand what it means to be a Catholic, and maybe even what it means to be Universalist. Well, what is that going to mean? That's going to depend on the proposal. It's going to depend on the particular synthesis that's being offered. Just to throw out one quick example, and then hopefully that'll kind of stand for what could be possible in other cases. It's clear, for example, that the Catholic teaching distinguishes purgatory from hell. And if you're a lot of patristic universalists will want to just merge those, like the fires of hell are purgative. So if you want to be a dedicated Catholic on that question and maintain that distinction while also being a confident universalist, how do you do it? Well, one way to do it that I think has hardly been explored, although it's kind of always been under the surface in a lot of thinkers, East and West actually, is to say there is a difference between the destination of those that are truly the work of God, like true persons, true selves, or what Paul called, basically putting on just Christ, and then what he also called the old man, which you have to put off and destroy. So if hell is a place of absolute destruction, place of total obliteration of what's evil, or what Balthasar called the unusable residue, which sin incarnates, like we incarnate false versions of ourselves, you can see then perhaps a proposal where the false self that I've lived into, or many selves that I've lived into and falsely identified myself, needs to be severed away from the true. I need to put on Christ by severing off and putting off the old man. Well, where does the old man go? To hell. It's not the same thing as going to purgatory, right? Now, some people will evaluate that proposal differently. They might think it's good or bad, or parts need to be worked on. But the point is, it's a way of thinking Catholically, because you're upholding the distinction that is proper to Catholic teaching, and yet you're thinking Universalist direction, because you do maintain that the true work of God that every person is will be saved, but that will entail a process of judgment, of severing, of even of disintegration, wrought through the very person being saved. That does issue in two different destinations, for the false and true self. Some people will be like, that's way too much detail, I don't need all that, True, right. But the point is, if you're a Catholic and you want to say that the Universalist outlook does correspond or can correspond to the Catholic one, that would be an example of something you'd have to face up to. Well, what do you do with that? So anyway, there's a whole bunch of issues like that. And so I think that Catholicism is sufficiently deep, wide, and rich, and Universalism is sufficiently deep, wide, and rich, that the two can be brought together and mutually illuminating even. Final word on that would be, it's not at all clear to me that, say, Augustinian predestination, as it's laid out, especially in a text like Ad Simplicianum, written around the time the Confessions was, where you get a pretty strong already Augustine, he'll just develop it even more, but you get a strong picture of an Augustine who thinks no one can be righteous unless they're elected to become righteous. And that's why Jacob I loved, right, he loved him and then Jacob was righteous. It's not as if God found Jacob righteous and then loved him. It's not clear to me that stream, which is taken up all the way through Thomas Aquinas and beyond, it's not clear to me that stream is so easily reconcilable with even current day acceptable Catholic positions on hell, say like the free will theodicy defense of hell, or like the C.S. Lewis type doors locked from the inside. It's certainly not what Augustine thought. He didn't think you just had a perpetual opportunity to accept God, but maybe somebody might, it's possible that they might just reject God forever. He thinks that unless God makes you righteous, you're going to reject God forever. That's different. Or the Council of Trent saying, for example, that the fires of hell, they pursue every kind of justice and afflict retribution on the damned. Well, that's not really what Ratzinger said. It's certainly not what the current catechism says. And it's interesting to compare the different catechisms as they change on this section. Okay, so that's the point, right? That Catholicism is sufficiently rich, dynamic, and deep, and it has changed even on this exact issue about what hell is, the doctrine of hell. And then I think Universalism has many different expressions, possibilities, approaches, more formal analytic ones, more existential ones, more literary ones, more deeply sophisticated theological ones, right? Ascetic versions of it, and so forth. These things can be variously configured. And I think and so I think there is no absolute judgment. You can say yes or no, Universalism and Catholicism, can they go together? There is no absolute judgment. It's which one, which version, and on what respect, right? This is the work of theology. It's determinate. It's too easy to go back on slogans. Pantheism, Pelagianism, Universalism, Catholicism. You got to get into what is someone actually saying? Why are they saying it? What are they not saying? Can these things be reconciled, and if so, how? I mean, those are all detailed questions. So my very existence kind of makes the wager, and other people that I know that are Catholic, dedicated Catholics, and confident Universalists, our existence makes the wager that yes, in fact, these can be reconciled, and they're being reconciled among a lot of different people of all different walks of life from the Catholic Church, and so it's being synthesized in us. And beyond us, right? So that's the wager, that's the wager that our very existence kind of holds out.